I'm Richard Milne. I'm a sociologist by background, and I've been working for a while now on ethical questions, social and ethical questions associated with the development of new technologies, particularly new medical technologies. I worked for a long time actually based in the BRC on work around Alzheimer's disease and neurodegenerative diseases. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I moved to Wellcome Connecting Science, which is a research centre, which is the kind of social sciences part of the Sanger Institute, which is itself a kind of the genomics institute just outside Cambridge in Hinxton, where there are a couple of thousand people working on genomic data and in laboratory spaces, and about 5 or 6 social scientists and ethicists. And then from the beginning of this year, already from April properly, myself and my colleague Anna Middleton, who's the director of the centre, and Catherine Galloway, launched this centre for ethics, science, and the public. Let me share some slides here. So, can you see my slides? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay. So this centre was, as I said, launched in April. It's a partnership between the University of Cambridge, we're based in the Faculty of Education, and Wellcome Connecting Science in Hinxton, and it's funded by the Kavli Foundation, who are a philanthropic foundation based in California. And most of the research that the Kavli Foundation funds is around neuroscience, nanotechnology, astrophysics, and they decided a couple of years ago that they really wanted to pay more attention to some of the ethical consequences and implications of the research that was happening in those fields and across cutting edge science more widely, and think about how we can have better conversations with the public about the kind of controversial aspects of science, and help scientists both engage with those ethical questions and with the public to talk about them. So that's our mission as a whole, basically. And there we go. But the background for it is really, I mean, you can't go more than a few days really at the moment without seeing some news story or public debate around something to do with science and technology, or the kind of consequences of novel science and technology. I mean, these are a few primarily based around genomics, because that's where we've been working for the last few years, but around questions about genetic privacy, data privacy more generally, who has access to your health data, and particularly whether companies whether companies, whether it's Google or Virgin or whoever, should have access to health data. Questions around AI and big data, and the biases and the ability of AI and data science to reproduce existing inequalities, whether that's in health or in other parts of life. And then questions that are more kind of classically, I suppose, around the ethics of whether you should do things. So this headline, the Bezos-backed startup headline, is a recent story about Altos Labs, which has just started up work outside Cambridge, and is aimed at how you can delay the aging process, essentially, and kind of questions around what we should be doing in that space and who will have access to it. And then obviously over the last couple of years, there've been an awful lot of discussions around the ethics of science and around questions of public trust related to COVID vaccination particularly, but also the use of COVID testing and the whole framework of data collection and use around that. So that's kind of, I suppose, where we're coming out. We're looking at these big ethical and social questions around the use of science and the direction of science and the kinds of futures that we want to build using the science and that we do. We're less focused, I suppose, on some of the kind of processes around ethics review, or some of what you see in that kind of practical doing of ethics within a research environment, about what's ensuring proper informed consent and things like that. We have done work around that in the past, and it's inevitably part of doing good science as a whole. But in terms of the research and engagement, public engagement work we're going to be doing, it's less to the fore. So our aim overall is to foster global conversations and build trust by engaging publics. So not recognizing the fact that there isn't a single homogenous public, but everybody sits in various different positions in society in relation to different topics, and scientists, again, across disciplines, across fields, across countries, with the ethics of science and its impact on society. And there are three strands of our work. So the first is kind of research and scholarship around how do we do this well, and how do we increase the agency of public audiences, but also of scientists, to engage with the ethical issues raised by science. How do we make people feel that they have a voice in these questions, and this is something that they can engage with and can make a difference about? And then to go from that research and scholarship to develop new ways of talking to people, new public engagement frameworks, specifically around ethical issues raised by breakthrough discoveries in the science. And to do this in ways that are perhaps slightly different from the kind of classic models of people giving a talk, or trying to work with various different creative partners and creative organizations to find ways that that public audiences and scientists, again, can engage and interact, and capturing evidence about what works and what doesn't, with the overall goal that our work is contributing to strengthening the social contract between scientific communities and diverse publics. So that's us. That's me in the middle. That's Anna Middleton at the top, who's the director, and Catherine Galloway at the bottom, who's the innovation and translation lead. As I said, we're funded by the Kavli Foundation. They also funded a second centre, which is based at the University of California, Berkeley. And we've been going for 3 months, and a lot of that time is been set up. So to the point where we're now in a situation where we're going to have more researchers, people working on public engagement, and administrators and PhD students starting from October this year. We also have 2 PhD students working already with it between Faculty of Education and Connecting Science, who are now affiliated with the centre. And we have a team of around 15 people who work with us at Connecting Science, who deliver a schools engagement program around genomics, who do social science research, and who do wider public engagement activities around genomics. So everybody's kind of the work at Connecting Science and the work at Kavli are very close and collaborative. So this is kind of one large group in 2 parts. And yeah, I'll skip through this, but essentially I just wanted to show this kind of that we have a research program which is primarily around social sciences research and bioethics, and then a kind of engagement program as well. And they loop together, essentially, is to understand the context that we're working in, to try and empower people, and to try to put things into practice. So that's where we're coming from and how we're going to be working. And what we're going to do is to start off with an initial focus. So within the idea of public engagement around ethical issues associated with science and bringing public voices into science, science is a very big place to start. So we're focusing initially on genomics, data science, and AI as areas which are still very large, but which are also presenting specific tangible ethical questions, whether that's around the collection of genomic data or gene editing, whether it's around the representativeness of the data sets, or how aware we are of who's monitoring or surveilling us through technology, or around the biases and uses of AI. We're focusing within that primarily around the life sciences and towards the medical sciences, and we are not creating everything from new, in a sense. There is a lot of existing work that's gone on in this space. So since the early 1990s, there's been this program of research on the ethical, legal and social implications of genetics that was funded alongside the Human Genome Program, and that has expanded into a kind of field of its own right. More recently, European funders particularly, but also research councils in the UK have put a lot of emphasis on responsible research and innovation programs and training for scientists and those going through PhD programs and master's level training. There's a lot of work around public engagement with science and how to do this well, and then obviously around science communication as well. So that's kind of our starting evidence base. And some of the work we're going to do, as part of that understanding the context, we're going to be looking at how and why do practicing scientists engage with ethics? Like, when does that happen in the process of a scientific career? What are the things what are the tools and resources that they're able to turn to help resolve these questions, or who are the people that they turn to? One of the issues that has been encountered through, say, the Human Genome Program and the history of genetics has been often that because you have a program of research around ethical, legal, social implications, there's a sense in which you can kind of park questions around ethics and the impact of genetics on society as being somebody else's problem. It's there for somebody else to think about, and that they'll get the answers and that'll then feed back into research. And so part of what we're trying to look at is how questions around the social and ethical implications of science can become normalized as part of everyday science. And actually, when they are, which is often also the case, when people do reflect on what they're doing, why they're doing it, how do we recognize that? So there are 3 projects initially happening around that. One is a kind of horizon scanning to try and work out what's going on, what are being identified as being the big questions associated with science, and how are those feeding down into research practice. We're going to be doing some ethnographic research, so observation-based research, working with scientists and in laboratories and in data science contexts as well, where they're slightly more distributed. Trying to understand that kind of day-to-day life of science and where those questions around ethics come up, and then doing some broader qualitative research, interviewing people across fields and at various different career stages to try and understand how these questions play out differently. And then alongside that, we're going to be looking at how and why do various different public groups engage with ethics. So the kind of cornerstone of that is going to be a large-scale international survey, which is going to run across ultimately around about 30 countries, trying to understand how questions about the types of science that we should do and the kinds of societies that we want science to contribute to relate to different value systems, different local political and cultural framings of science, and then doing some smaller qualitative studies to actually try and understand what it is that these surveys are telling us and how we ask the right questions. So that builds on work that we've done the last few years around genomics, where we've had a survey running across 22 different countries. We're going to do some training, develop a training program in what we're calling reflective ethical practice, which is really going to be focused on giving researchers the tools to answer these questions and a framework to work with, but also creating spaces in which people can come and talk about things that in their research that they're not quite sure about, and they don't want to go to an ethics committee, or they don't want to it to be a big question, but they really want to be able to talk through and work through things to make sure that they're sure about the direction that they're going in. We're going to be working with a range of creative partners, and one of the things that I think I'd be interested in hearing from you about is that we're also going to launch an international public panel, initially UK based, and then spreading to our partner organizations, which are based in Japan, China and India, and then trying to grow that internationally to have a kind of standing group of people around the world who can come together and provide a lay perspective to inform our work, but also that researchers, particularly those who are thinking about doing internationally significant research, can come and talk to that group about. And then the final strand of work that I wanted to flag up now is deliberative dialogue. So that's so deliberative approaches to public engagement are those that are aimed at bringing a public voice into decision making in some way through a process of evidence-based reasoning, of pulling together a lay public group, but allowing them to hear from and to ask questions of experts, and to develop their own set of recommendations for practice in a particular area. And if that sounds a little bit woolly, what I want to do is to give you an example from work that we've got up and coming in the next couple of months, which is around gene editing, and particularly the use of CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology. So for those who maybe haven't come across CRISPR-Cas9, it was a technique developed in 2015 to manipulate specific sections of DNA. And one of the promises of this technology is that it might offer the potential for novel treatments for some of the 4,000 known inherited single gene conditions. But it also presents or represents a lot of questions that have been around for a long time around gene therapy and genetic selection technologies, around what are the limits of how we might use this tool. Do we want to make modifications to the human germline that will be inherited into the future? Where do we draw the line between technologies that are for medical purposes and those that might be for enhancement? And how do we ensure that these tools are available to those who need them the most, as opposed to those who can afford them the most? So almost as soon as CRISPR technology was developed, it became clear that there was a need for a global discussion about how this tool would be used. So the first of those global discussions happened at the International Summit for Human Gene Editing in 2015, held in Washington, DC. And so that summit produced a report on what the future of gene editing should look like. And I just pulled out one clause from that report to show you, which was just that the report concluded that it would be irresponsible to proceed with any clinical use of germline editing. So that's changing the genome in a way that would be inherited, as opposed to changing it, say, in a way that might allow treatment in one individual at this time, unless and until the relevant safety and efficacy issues have been resolved, which in a sense is the same as for any new medical technology. You want to know that it's safe and you want to know that it works, but also to ensure that there's broad societal consensus about the appropriateness of the proposed application. So that's recognizing the fact that the conditions that we might choose to target with CRISPR may not be self-evident and may be contested in some places. So particularly that line between therapy and enhancement, and that this isn't a question that the experts in this summit felt that they could answer, but that was something that required a broader conversation and the involvement of policymakers, but also of publics. So that was 2015. Not too long later, so November 2018, which was coincidentally that was the month I started working at Connecting Science at the Sanger Institute and moved back to working on genomics. The Chinese scientist He Jiankui announced that he had successfully introduced genes into the genomes of two twins who'd been born, and that he was hoping that these modifications would confer resistance to the HIV virus, modifications in a gene called CCR5 that has been associated in observational studies with resistance to HIV infection. And you may remember that this becoming a story in that kind of pre-pandemic world, in which there was widespread denunciation of what He Jiankui had done. He himself was arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison by the Chinese authorities, and fined and lost his academic status. The children who whose genes were edited, and their families went into hiding, and we don't really have a lot of information about where they are and how they are now. And it produced a range of commentary. So this is Jennifer Doudna, who was the co-inventor of CRISPR, won the Nobel Prize last year with Emmanuel Charpentier for her work, and described how she was horrified and disgusted with how her work had been used. And it provoked statements from people like Francis Collins at the National Institute of Health. So despite this call to wait for broad societal consensus, He Jiankui went ahead, and we're now in a world in which gene editing has been done, but probably not in a way that anybody would want it to have been done, and in a way that we're trying to kind of row back from. And this then kind of brings back to life this question about, whose decision is this? Who should be making this? Is this a broad societal consensus? Because if you look at the quote at the bottom there, so He Jiankui said that he accepted that there were going to be many vocal critics of this, but there were also many silent families who'd seen a child suffer from genetic disease, and that even though they may not be the director of an ethics centre quoted by the New York Times, they're no less authorities on what's right and wrong, because it's their life on the line. So kind of arguing that this was a decision for those patients themselves and for their families. The other side of the argument is presented by, and I suppose the side that the kind of consensus following that gene editing summit is presented by the Sheila Jasanoff, who's a professor of law at Harvard, and colleagues, writing about how the human genome isn't the property of any particular culture, nation, or region, and it's not the property of science. In fact, it belongs equally to every member of our species, and that if we want to tinker with it, we have to be accountable to humanity as a whole. But it does leave the question, like, what does that actually look like? And I'm going to stop it. I'm coming to the end now, because this is essentially where this is what this looks like in practice. So this was a policy form published in Science, I think, in 2020, by a team of researchers led by John Dryzek, and including my colleague Anna Middleton, talking about developing a global citizen deliberation on genome editing. So bringing lay citizens together around the world to think about a responsible way forwards in terms of genome editing. And so to date, so these citizens' deliberations have happened in a few places. There's been one in Australia, there's been one in Belgium, one in the Netherlands, and one in the US, starting to try and build this, what this global consensus would look like. And in our team at the Kavli Centre and at Connecting Science, we're going to be running the British arm of that work in September this year. It's a project which has been delayed several times as we've moved online, offline through the pandemic, but we are hopeful at the moment, keeping everything crossed, that this is going to happen in person in September in Hinxton. And our specific focus is going to be around whether there are any circumstances under which a UK government should consider changing the law to allow germline genome editing, human germline genome editing, for the treatment of for therapeutic purposes. And for the purposes of answering that question, we're bringing together a jury of 25 people who have some connection to a genetic condition, either because they're living with a genetic condition themselves, or they're the parents or carers of somebody who has, and we're partnering with Genetic Alliance on that. So these 25 people will come to Hinxton, and they'll spend 4 days listening to experts in genetics, in genetic medicine, so with clinicians from Addenbrooke's contributing, in ethics and bioethics, and from the patient, an inpatient experience and the patient perspective. And at the end of day 3, they will develop their own set of recommendations, and on day 4, they will present those to a representative of the Department of Health. And so our aim with this event is to better understand public views and develop and deliver these recommendations on the future use of heritable human genome editing in the UK. And then also we're interested in using it to understand how that deliberation process works and to feed back into that broader question of how do we do good engagement around these controversial and sensitive ethical questions and bring public voices into policy decisions on science. So that's where I'll leave it for now. And hopefully you'll agree. I think, yeah, we're all really excited about the centre and really enjoying the kind of process of getting it started. I would be really interested to hear from this group who cover a lot of the science that goes on in Cambridge, about where you think these kinds of conversations about ethics and the public can be most useful, and what we might learn from what you've done, from what you do have done in the past, and also, for you, what are the most pressing ethical questions you encounter in research, and how do you think that the researchers who are doing this research might go about dealing with these issues, and how might they do it better?